Could the Belarusian forces join with Russia and invade Ukraine? There are some strong suggestions that Belarus may be planning to do just that, but before we get to the why and the how, a quick little backstory for the events of the last few days leading up to this question. On October 8th, there was a sizable explosion on the bridge between Crimea and mainland Ukraine, now mainland-occupied Ukraine. The precise nature of the explosion is still unclear, some alleging the use of an unmanned watercraft carrying explosives, others saying it was caused by a truck driving across the bridge exploding. Regardless of the true nature of the attack, it was a big moral win for the Ukrainian forces. As the Crimean bridge's construction and security was a tremendous point of pride for Russian President Vladimir Putin. Much has also been said about the bridge's value as a logistical supply source, especially the railway bridge running alongside the motor traffic bridges, and certainly if substantial damage could be done to that railway bridge, then the strategic damage done to the Kherson front would be massive. However, the Russian side claims the bridge is already reopening, and that the damage done was insignificant. Of course, take whatever either side in a war says with a massive grain of salt, but from the footage I have seen at least, the railway bridge does look to have remained relatively intact and certainly repairable. But the more important question is, how is Russia going to respond? Because again, whilst this is not the first time Ukraine has launched an attack on Russian soil, but the Crimean bridge is something more than just a point of infrastructure. It is more than a point of logistical supply, even as significant as it could potentially be. It is Putin's very own baby. He personally drove a truck across the bridge upon its completion in 2018. And the bridge is a powerful symbol of Russian occupation of Crimea and now the Kherson Oblast as well. Thus, an attack upon the bridge also carries with it tremendous symbolic importance too. Now, the first part of Moscow's response was predictable enough. A massive strike against Ukrainian civilian and infrastructure targets. A tit-for-tat in the Russian view, with an extra emphasis to discourage any further attacks. But the far more interesting counter-move, and the topic for today's video, is the rather sudden Belarusian escalation, with their president Alexander Lukashenko stating that the armed forces of Belarus was going to, quote, deploy a regional grouping of the Russian Federation and the Republic of Belarus, and this was to be done in anticipation of a Ukrainian attack on Belarus. Now, of course, it would be remarkably stupid of Ukraine to do this, but excuses for war need hardly be good ones. And so, in all due likelihood, this is merely a preemptive pretense clearing the way for potential military action. Which in turn leaves us with several more questions. The most pressing, of course, being, can the Belarusian army pose a threat to Ukraine? And the answer to that is decidedly yes. Though the simple threat of military action may be almost as good for Putin as the actual realization of said threat, a point which we will return to a bit later. On paper, the armed forces of the Republic of Belarus are significant, with a standing army of some 50 to 60,000 men organized into 4 to 6 mechanized brigades, with organic artillery and AAA attachments. Furthermore, Belarus also has its territorial forces, National Guard equivalents numbering some 120,000 troops. Equipment and training-wise, the Belarusian soldiers are roughly comparable to the Russian soldier, with practically all of their vehicles and gear being Soviet-era equipment. The Belarus army also frequently trains alongside the Russian army, so the two are well accustomed to one another. In terms of troop quality, only the Special Operations Forces, the 5th Spetsnaz Brigade, appears to be maintained at full combat readiness. And the formation also, allegedly, had a large number of military advisors deployed to the Libyan civil war, so the brigade is likely to be quite professional. There also appears to be 2 other mechanized regiments maintained at high readiness, and 2 mechanized regiments at only partial strength. They also have a mobilization potential of perhaps as many as 300,000 men, but there is almost certainly no way Belarus is going to mobilize, at least not now, as, well, the nation is not necessarily in a stable situation. All in all, the Belarus army is certainly a regional power, and could, along with aid from the Russian troops already stationed in the country, prove a serious threat to Ukraine's northern border. On paper, at least. In reality, well, it is difficult to say for sure, but the Belarus army is very unlikely to be significantly better than the Russian army, and their equipment is at best comparable and most of the time a few decades inferior. And considering how poorly the Russian army has fared in Ukraine, it might be tempting to think that the Belarus army would not be any real threat either, but what it may lack in quality, it may make up for in simple territorial danger. The Ukraine-Belarus border is just a smidge over 1,000 kilometers long, or 620 miles. That is a lot of extra border for Ukraine to guard. Now, of course, not all of it is conducive to military operations. There are relatively few major roads crossing the border, and there is a lot of swamp and heavy woodlands as well in the area, and of course there is the Chernobyl exclusion zone, which is to be avoided for obvious reasons. But even so, the potential threat of 60,000 troops coming barreling down one of the viable approaches is a very serious one, and the Ukrainian troops guarding the border are by now mostly National Guard-style troops and reserves themselves. Worse still is the probable fact that most of the cool-ass Western hardware that is streaming into Ukraine will have long since been sent south and east, where Ukraine is carrying out offensive operations. And obviously, focusing the neat new toys on these areas make a lot of sense, but also means that the rear-line troops may not be adequately equipped to meet a new major invasion threat. A great deal of the reason for why Ukraine did so well as it did in the initial Russian invasion was because of the technological superiority afforded to the Ukrainian army via precisely these Western toys. And if they are not available in adequate enough numbers to National Guard and rear-line reserves, etc., well, those 60,000 outdated Belarusian troops might find themselves fighting Ukrainians with just as outdated equipment. But is Belarus in any position to actually make good on that threat? Or is the threat the most potent thing that Lukashenko can offer up to his Russian masters? Because, you see, Belarus is not quite so free or quite so prepared as they are trying to make it sound. Whilst, yes, again, the Belarus army certainly is a potential danger in terms of sheer manpower at least, and in terms of border, the time for offensive operations is beginning to run out quickly. For both sides as well, mind you, as winter is closing in. Now, Ukraine is hardly the coldest place on earth, so says the Norwegian, but even so, any military operations in winter time is going to get very complicated very quickly. Snow and mud and cold, placing an enormous strain on men, trucks, and vehicles of all types. It will also be very interesting, by the way, to see how the two primary combatants deal with this. On the one hand, the Russian army holds frequent cold weather exercises, and should therefore be well prepared for the many challenges that winter might bring. But with Putin's mobilization and the apparent state of some of the Russian equipment, one has to wonder if they are going to have enough cold weather gear to go around. Meanwhile, Ukraine has not carried out a lot of large and complex cold weather exercises, if any at all, but they will receive anything and everything they could possibly want and need in enormous quantities from the West. I am very intrigued to see how that will work out. I might even do a video on winter tactics and challenges at some point, but before I wander too far off the reservation here, there is another reason still to believe that maybe the Belarusian saber-rattling is mostly noise and very little action, because, again, Alexander Lukashenko is not a particularly popular president, despite winning every single election ever with 80 to 90% of the votes. Yes, that kind of president. And there are fears of coup attempts being made in the country, with Russia, as usual, accusing the US of fermenting it, and the US in turn accusing Russia of keeping Lukashenko in power as a puppet president via less than fair elections. And these fears of a coup may well keep the best of the Belarusian army at home to protect their president, as the 5th Spetsnaz Brigade was involved in discouraging the mass-scale protests that shot up in the nation after the 2020 election, where Lukashenko won once again with over 80% of the votes. In an election that the West and apparently significant numbers of the Belarus populace found to be highly questionable. And in my ever-so-humble experience, presidents that need to deal with disobedient civilians via military means are very rarely eager to send their soldiers off to neighbouring countries, as they are very clearly needed at home to ensure peace and order. Personally, I could certainly see a Belarus army expeditionary force, or Belarus soldiers perhaps being deployed for real-line security for Russian positions, or even for Belarus to open its borders for future Russian military operations, like they did at the start of the war. But it seems unlikely to me, at least, that Belarus will join in the war directly. At least unless they are given a very good excuse by Ukraine or by Putin. Partially because the Belarus army is unlikely to perform that well, and partially because of the danger it will pose to Belarus's stability. Even already in Russia, a country that has a far more overall stable political situation, we are seeing a lot of people deciding to go on extended holidays rather than risk the draft. I would imagine that the reaction to any sort of mobilization in Belarus would be more poignant, shall we say. However, even without any overt military action, it may still prove to be a worthwhile bluff, as the Russian troops in Ukraine have not been doing very well recently, and Putin needs to buy at least another 2 to 3 months for his first wave of reinforcements, and another 6 months or more for his mobilization troops to be given at least basic training, as it is far from ideal to just throw untrained troops onto the front line. Even as there is suggestions going around that is precisely what is happening. And making Ukraine move good frontline formations into reserve positions in the north would undoubtedly weaken the Ukrainian offensives and possibly purchase Putin the time he needs. From the Ukrainian perspective, I would imagine that they would wish to continue their offensive operations at almost any cost and any risk. Yes, the danger of a Belarus-Russian invasion from the north is significant, but the Russian army right now is probably as weak as it is ever likely to be. And to give up the initiative now for a potential threat, that is a difficult thing to do. Even more so as, again, the window for offensives may very well be beginning to close. Now, perhaps Ukraine has confidence in their ability to continue aggressive operations throughout winter. Indeed, they may even have a distinct advantage over the Russian troops during winter conditions, presuming enough Western hardware can make it into the Ukrainian arsenal. But once more, the Ukrainian troops' apparent lack of large-scale operational exercises in winter conditions could prove very challenging to get around. Operating during winter times is simply just a real hellish thing to do, and even for countries like Norway, which you'd think would be used to it by now, we hold massive military exercises damn near every year or so. We also have the Cold Response exercise, which has several other nations join us for our exercises, specifically because this is the kind of knowledge that needs to be refreshed continuously. But only time will tell on the winter warfare front. We will probably learn far sooner than that, though, if Belarus actually has any intent to join the Russian invasion. Personally, I would say probably not, but at the same time, if they sense weakness, all bets are off. Do let me know what you guys all think down in the comment section below, and until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.